So yeah, oh look, the title of this panel was Paradise Engineering. What a wonderful title. We can continue on from where Andreas left. I think that would be the most seamless option, because it was rather fascinating in my opinion, and I wouldn't like to break continuity. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, one thing, lots of interesting points Andrés raised. One is, what is the optimal level of focus on suffering the abolitionist project? And I think, yeah, even if one is a committed Buddhist negative utilitarian that thinks overriding ethical priorities should be minimizing, preventing, abolishing suffering, that single-minded focus on suffering and nothing else is a recipe for burnout and being ineffective. And I've seen this to some extent. I've also experienced it myself. Self-care shouldn't be seen as some kind of vanity, that one can do more good in this world in some sense. Maybe it is a degree of affective psychosis. Selective ignorance and hiding the nature of suffering. I found some of the stuff on the logarithmic scale of pleasure and pain very difficult to listen to. Even the nature of post-human superintelligence, in some sense, I think, once intelligent moral agents have made sure, absolutely certain, that they have fulfilled all their obligations in terms of understanding our ability to prevent, mitigate suffering, that in some sense, then, we should be striving for ignorance of the Darwinian era. There are clearly immense dangers of such a scenario, premature ignorance. But as I said, it's not straightforward. This is a rather rambling comment. No, it's not straightforward how much of one's time one should be spending thinking, focusing, empathizing, working on suffering, even if, like me, you think it's an overriding obligation.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with David. I would say probably in 2019 I was on the verge of burnout when I was writing the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain article. Just too tough of a topic, but no, I mean, I think like it's essential if you're kind of into this high impact type of work, to really take seriously self-care, as David says. And even if you're like a hardcore negative utilitarian, there are second order reasons to essentially care about paradise engineering or increasing baseline, exploring peak experiences, for a lot of pragmatic reasons. I mean, first of all, Jeffrey Miller has this beautiful presentation called Signaling in EA, or runaway signaling cascades in effective altruism. I'm pretty sure I made a transcript of it and put it on Quality Computing, where you see that when you have a community of people who share a lot of values, effectiveness, and they're all very smart, and they all care about quantifying things. A lot of the resources actually get spent on signaling your affiliation to it, as opposed to actually doing productive work. And a lot of that signaling ends up being really counterproductive. So there's the failure mode of signaling how burnt out you are, as a way of kind of signaling your virtue. So something that I think is really essential to avoid, for example, in negative utilitarian circles, or even vegan activists, is essentially falling into the trap of becoming really depressed, because that's the way in which you signal how much you actually take seriously the problem, or something like that, how much you're able to actually see the problem, which is extremely counterproductive, right? So that's why I envisioned that, kind of like a movement or community positive feedback loop that focuses on negative extremes, baseline, and achieving new heights, they complement each other. Essentially avoids burnout, and there's a lot of synergies in there. And yeah, I mean, obviously, on a personal basis, I would say something like the sustainable path that I have found is something like, working maybe 4 hours a day on tough stuff, and then making sure I go for long walks and go to the beach, and actually have a pleasant life otherwise, and enjoy big experiences every once in a while. It actually gives you a motivation to live, wake up every day. I also think, though, some subset of people probably are temperamentally able to just work on this all the time. They're probably really rare. And actually, they are the sort of people who would be able to work on any. So, a hardcore kind of like CEO of a large company who literally works, 16 hours a day, sleeps, 4 hours a day. There are people like that. And there are people who can sustain that for decades with no problem. It would be great to have more people like that in the community. But I think it's very unhealthy to expect yourself to be that way, because the gap is going to be very evident after a while, and burnout is a very serious thing. It's important to avoid. I am very curious. I mean, I think this is the first time I present in a very explicit way kind of like the importance of those three pillars. So definitely people agree or disagree, or if there's resonance, or if people have suggestions for how I can craft the message in a different way, I'm very open to any feedback at this point. It's not married to anything here. Happy to and Andy?
Sorry, I was muted. I guess on the topic of burnout, I was wondering if you had any advice for, I guess there are some days where I personally, and I don't know if you can relate, but I sometimes feel like the baseline of my current state is just, it feels like pleasure is sort of adding to this nothingness. It's hard to describe. For example, sometimes I feel like there's this sort of deep-rooted sadness. Like I get too overwhelmed with how much suffering there is, and it sort of feels like that's more overwhelming than the pleasure that I'm sort of able to experience. Like sort of the pain is more than the pleasure, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, I guess sometimes I'm convinced that pain is sort of like stronger than pleasure, and I kind of want to sort of know how. I guess I'm not an expert meditator, so maybe meditation is one step closer to having a stronger, pleasurable baseline. But sometimes, it does really feel, when I'm a bit depressed, feels quite convincing to me that suffering is sort of more overwhelming and more, it's like winning the battle against pleasure in a sense.
Yeah. There's several things I could mention here. And, David Pearce is basically a very strong prioritarian or negative utilitarian. But I'm speaking for David, sorry. but still recognizing the inherent value in positive valence. I would say I'm agnostic here. I mean, essentially, yes, in a sad frame of mind, there's sort of thought like, pain or suffering has won in some cosmic sense because it's just more significant or something like that. Those are very natural thoughts to have while you're having a negative experience. But the flip side to that is that, if you're coming up on MDMA or just loving kindness or something, it actually can feel the opposite. It feels like, oh gosh, the default state is just perfect happiness. And suffering is kind of this weird rounding error, kind of like at the surface of this deep ocean of bliss. And in meditation, I've had that impression, and in the moment, it feels really convincing. So I would definitely be skeptical of kind of the epistemology of using, thoughts within a particular range of hedonic tone to kind of infer something at the cosmic level. I think that's definitely kind of stepping over one's boundaries. And also I'm fundamentally agnostic here. I mean, I think that the truth will be obtained by actually creating a mathematical formalism of valence that whether positive, negative, or classical utilitarianism is the case, will pop out of the math. And that's an expression Mike has used in kind of this context. Which, yeah, it's unfortunately he's not able to make it. He would be able to tell you more about kind of that particular perspective. The thing I'll also mention is that the symmetry theory of valence also does have something kind of crazy to say here, which is that in one interpretation, where actually the amount of consciousness comes from the information content of the experience, which I don't agree with this, but there's one kind of a interpretation here. When you have like perfect symmetry, essentially one of these like peak states like Nirodha Samapatti or high dose 5-MeO DMT, what that theory would predict is that you actually become fully unconscious, because the information that your consciousness is made of comes from symmetry breaking operations. So in that theory, if you want to maximize positive valence, you will always require like slightly mixed experiences, where let's say like you have like 99.9999% of positive valence well-being, but you have a pinch, a tiny bit of something that is uncomfortable, that is providing the information content. And this is also actually something that, somebody like Roger Thiesdale resonates quite a bit. Like, so I recommend reading the article called The Supreme State of Unconsciousness in Qualia Computing, where, basically he argues that like, the best state is just no consciousness at all. So that's kind of like a super, extreme version of this, who says that, the absence of experience is the best state. I personally don't think that is the case. But I would say it's a rather subtle debate, and actually having experienced, things like cessations and Nirodha Samapatti probably does inform his opinion in a way that, I don't have that information.
That makes sense. Thank you.
In my hypothesis, just to follow up, in my hypothesis, what happens in something like Nirodha Samapatti or 5-MeO DMT is not that you stop being conscious, it's just that you have a state of consciousness with zero information. So it's this very strange thing that you are, like there's a being there, it's just that there's no information to remember. So I do suspect that is like perfect happiness, and perfect happiness just has no information, which is this weird thing. It doesn't mean you don't exist. It just means you're shaped in such a way you can't retrieve anything from it.
I think one of the cool things about the, if I'm correct, I remember seeing on the QRI website a big list of glossary of terms and ways to describe experience. Yeah. And so, the way that people feel are often just put in very simple terms, like I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling happy, but if we had a wider vocabulary, a wider agreed on and I guess objective shared sort of lexicon of well-described terms, then we could be more clear about how we're feeling compared to how other people might be feeling. And that might help for a lot of reasons. But I guess the difficulty is getting people to pick it up and use this sort of shared lexicon, because there's probably a lot of discussion about qualia or consciousness that goes over shoulders because people are making assumptions about their definitions and assuming that what I feel about love or happiness or something like that might be something completely different from the person I'm talking to. And they might be hearing something completely different from what I'm expressing, what I feel I'm expressing. So, yeah. Is this a concern for you?
Yeah, definitely. In my experience, I don't know. I hope this may be somewhat of a heterodox, perspective. But in my experience, essentially, the best discussions about consciousness and probably about any technical field, honestly, happen when you have like a critical mass of people who are like all in the same wavelength. In that, like, sure, maybe they have like different experience bases, but they all share enough philosophical background assumptions such that they actually can make progress. They're not like bogged down by definitions and talking past each other and misconceptions and all of that. And that takes a lot of work because there's so many words and so many concepts to get up to speed on. And a lot of kind of the things they end up doing on a day-to-day basis, you could think of it as kind of educational. It's kind of like bringing people up to speed to kind of like various concepts and paradigms of the Qualia Research Institute and adjacent fields. Like not only do I explain concepts, that we developed, but also, concepts from neuroscience or, dynamic systems, whatever it may be. I think really the big progress happens in what I might describe as kind of a think tanks of people who are like fairly in tune with each other, like have spent years kind of like refining their vocabulary. At the same time, I think like an essential ingredient here is what I call epistemological optimism, because like a lot of people kind of go into these fields or even trying to analyze meditation with a lot of pessimism about the ability that we have for describing experiences. I think to a large extent, experiences are actually describable. I think like a lot of what you experience on even something crazy like LSD, actually you can put names to, you can describe in very, very fine detail. It's just that we haven't done the work. Obviously we're trying to get there. But the fact that there's like just so much low-hanging fruit we have discovered over, the last 5 years of trying to describe exotic states of consciousness in terms of algorithmic processes interacting with one another. I think, the progress will just continue. So the other resource I would encourage people to look is there's this book called Seeing That Frees by Robert Bia, a meditation teacher. I have a chapter of it called High Valence Meditation that I transcribed for Qualia Computing. It's fascinating because like all of the things that he describes are like very precise vocabulary to talk about like the fine distinctions in meditation. And like all of them are actually highly consistent with the symmetry theory of valence, about how like eliminating a blockage in the quote unquote energy flow of your meditation increases valence, or smoothing out shear points or pinch points, or all of those things. Yes, they're super compatible with the symmetry theory of valence. And my sense is that, there's going to be like a Mozart of phenomenology who will be able to, smoke DMT and then for the next 2 hours explain in detail every single thing that happened. I think that's possible. It's just like, it's just a matter of kind of a talent, vocabulary, getting the field to the right depth. Again, I advocate for epistemological optimism. Like, we can do it, guys. We can do it.
Yes.
It's not just ineffable.
But at the moment, what we're relying on is people's descriptive explanations of how they personally feel. I'm also really interested in the future of actually using sensors, BCIs, magnetoencephalograms, fMRI++, whatever's next after those generations of technologies. It just gets really like intense, high resolution 3D sort of mappings of what's going on in whatever relevant parts of the body that give rise to our sensation, and being able to then map the patterns. I think, I'm very interested in seeing where that's going. If there was a billionaire out there who could fund research and development into capturing this sort of information or honing the tools to do so, I'd say that would be quite a useful thing to spend some money on. That is, trying to get an objective measurement of as much objective measurement as you can in real time of the physical processes going on inside the body that gives rise to our experience, and then informing the mathematical sort of structure.
Some of the work that we've done at QRI involves essentially investigating the neuroimaging of very high valence states of consciousness, so like MDMA. All of that is like work in progress, but I can mention that like a fascinating data set we took a look at was Daniel Ingram's Fruitions, which is like, super advanced meditator. He wrote this book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. He's probably the number one phenomenologist in the world that I know, probably by a long shot. Like, he can describe like things such as like what happens at scales of like, he can note 20 things that happens within 1 second and like tell you exactly what happened in 1 second of an experience. And he uses like that level of precision to talk about like what happens in the moment of enlightenment or in the moment of association, the moment of a transition to a different jhana. He did a lot of like EEG meditation, or like he would put on the EEG and then go on meditation retreats. And he captured something like 78 moments of fruitions, which are like these moments where experience disappears and you have like peak positive valence. And yeah, you could see in the brainwaves, all of the channels actually synchronizing and entering a very brief moment of hypercoherence, exactly when he experiences a fruition. But yeah, it's very compatible with like, oh gosh, like the information content dropped to 0, even though there's energy here, but like the information dropped to 0. And yeah, but I mean, obviously it's a continuum, and yeah, very likely in the future we'll have like 3D precise like valence quantifying technology. We should probably think about what we're going to do with that. David, I wonder if you have anything to add. Yeah?
Oh, well, no, I was just enjoying your riff. No, unfortunately, I'm a retired psychonaut insofar as my imagination, my mind is too dark for me to explore consciousness and radically altered states. And if one does have a dark Darwinian imagination, I think one should generally be discouraged from becoming a psychonaut. What two other points? From when I did explore altered states, I remember being absolutely resolute about how I was going to write down as clearly as I could, so that when the next day I had reverted to ordinary waking consciousness, I could have some insight into what I was missing, even though the state dependence of memory would mean it wasn't fully accessible. And unfortunately, too much of the stuff was completely inexpressible. Our conceptual scheme does not allow us to describe many of these altered states. I mean, one could here go into a discussion of Wittgenstein's anti-private language argument too. That would take us far afield. In terms of conveying inexpressibility, I sometimes give the example of imagine a tribe of congenitally blind scientific rationalists. One member of the tribe takes a drug, and this drug gives him or her access to visual experience, but not, of course, sensory transducers or anything like that. And the drug taker who is undergoing what we would call visual experiences is convinced that they are inexpressibly profound, but how can he convey them to the elders of the tribe? He just starts babbling nonsense. Stepping back, in one sense, you could say I'm an optimist. I think that, the hard problem of consciousness is normally posed as soluble. I think the binding problem is soluble. I think the problem of causal efficacy is soluble. But in another sense, I'm also a super pessimist in that science does not explain really why we are experiencing anything at all, or why any of our qualia are what they are and not something else. I think in some sense, everything is encoded in the formalism. It's not as though there are some, hidden variables or something that the universe, it's all encoded in the universal wave function, but we don't have a kind of Rosetta Stone that would allow us to read off the textures of consciousness from the solutions of the equations. I said once we have phased out suffering, I suspect billions of years of exploring consciousness, state spaces of consciousness is going to be feasible. Whether we do it or not, or whether we go for a utilitarian shockwave, I don't know. But there's a bit of a tension here in that, does one want to maximize the amount of empirical value in reality. And insofar as one does want to maximize value, it's one is opting for hedonium. Is one deliberately going to reduce this maximum in favor of more complex states? Some kind of Heath Robinson or Rube Goldberg approach. In some sense, is it irrational to do so?
How will you test that you've phased out suffering, or how you know that you've reduced suffering, especially when you're dealing with a lot of species that can't talk or express concepts? Without an empirical approach.
I think it's striking whether one is talking about humans, pigs, dogs or worms. One has the same dopamine opioid system, same neurotransmitter system, same responses, behavioral responses to noxious stimuli. I am extremely confident that a worm with its dopamine opioid system can undergo, or the ganglia of a worm can undergo aversive states. By contrast, I don't think a classical digital computer can. Andrés, perhaps you could. I don't know.
Yeah. There's definitely the QRI optimistic answer that, actually, measuring the valence of something like a cricket is actually not going to be that difficult. I think just to put the cards on the table, I'm pretty sure. David is quite skeptical of the symmetry theory of valence, I think in one world, bliss is kind of there's a biomolecular signature of it, and then the way to probe whether a cricket is in suffering or not is by just looking at what is the biomolecular composition of the neurons, what is the structure of the secondary and tertiary protein structures inside the neurons and things like that. Whereas I guess in the QRI world, at least as far as we have gotten, it would be more along the lines of, quantify the resonant modes of the nervous system of a cricket, and then identify all the failure modes, essentially all the ways in which those resonant modes can enter into dissonance with one another, and then empirically measure how often that happens, and what is the energy associated to the dissonance within the component of resonance of those nervous systems, and that will give you an answer. Now, we suspect that will give you essentially how much distress or how much negative valence the cricket is experiencing. There might be some philosophical background assumptions needed to get there, but I think if we can show that these equations actually do explain, for example, the valence of MDMA in humans, and generalizes to new drugs or something like that, then I think our confidence will increase over time. And I do find it plausible. I'll pin a number on it. I'll say something I think there's 40% chance in the next couple of decades we will be able to precisely tell how much suffering or pleasure is a particular cricket or insect experiencing. I don't think it's that difficult of a problem. String theory is a lot harder, I think, than quantifying, the suffering of a cricket.
Oh, I'm fascinated. Yeah, I'd like to see it happen for sure in the near term. I'd just like to see the results. Yeah, but I think it's pretty important ethically to be able to sort of verify these sorts of things.
There's definitely another frontier, which is suffering in inanimate matter, which I think there's various stories here. I think in David's world, overwhelmingly most of the matter around us is mind dust. There's trivial amounts of consciousness, and also the valence is neutral, right? In QRI's world, actually, it's not entirely clear because valence was selected for information processing purposes in nervous systems, but also because of the symmetry theory of valence, in general, states of matter and energy that are in a coherent state and are self-reinforcing will tend to have inherent symmetries. So it's quite possible that actually, something like the mineral structure of quartz or something actually does have an intrinsic valence, and that adding impurities into the quartz is actually changing the valence, either for better or worse. It's going to depend on the details. And even weird things, like it may turn out to be the case that this thing called spin liquid, which is like a state of matter that has essentially no lowest energy that is in a symmetrical configuration. There's actually minerals that are like spin liquid. That might actually be a very negative hedonic tone, even though it plays no, behavioral or evolutionary role. So in my worldview, well, in the kind of extending David's vision to the whole universe will entail, not only getting rid of suffering in a small invertebrate at the bottom of the ocean, but also maybe fixing spin liquid in the crystal lattice of crystals, hidden in Io or in Pluto. Like those probably also have valence, which very outlandish. It's hard for me to say this and be taken seriously, but reality is weird.
Yeah, I mean, our gut feels about reality seem normal because that's the way we sort of live day to day, but reality is probably weirder than our gut feels could ever imagine.
You have no idea. If you ever sorry, go ahead, David.
No. Just going to say that yes, even though I am skeptical of this particular weird idea. I mean, essentially, the true explanation is going to be will strike us, I reckon, as absurd. So instead of focusing on weirdness, it's much better to focus on testability and falsifiability. And what is the likelihood that the true theory of consciousness, reality, has actually no novel and precise testable predictions? So this should be our focus.
Hopefully not very likely, right? I mean, if it had no novel testable aspects to it at all, you'd think that we were in a sort of a simulation put there by somebody who's has a rather wicked sense of humour. Really?
Well, wicked being the word, yes.
It is very much the case that, for example, general relativity, as formulated by Einstein, is actually the simplest mathematical formulation of an infinite number of mathematically equivalent theories for the dimensions that general relativity studies. They do generate different predictions, but not in this universe. And so in that sense, actually, it is impossible to tell which version of general relativity is correct, and we default to the mathematically simplest just from the point of view of parsimony. Now, we may actually stumble on something like that when it comes to, fundamental reality, but I'm hopeful that a further principle may actually be able to say, and by the way, of all the mathematically equivalent models for this dimension, this is the one that is correct because it's the only one that satisfies something like zero ontology or something like that. It's the only one that satisfies this further principle that, all information has to add up to zero or something like that. That's why I'm epistemologically optimistic that even if the final theory of reality doesn't generate further empirically testable predictions, there might still be a really powerful argument that rules out equivalent theories that are not precisely that one.
Even really crazy stuff that Andrés touched on, the kind of zero ontology. It will be possible to falsify it, even if whether or not it's actually true. All one needs to do is show that the information content of the universe exceeds zero, which ought to be feasible.
A comment definitely is that as weird as it sounds, I very much think that the problems that we were tackling at QRI, they're difficult, but they're not as difficult as the string theory. And is one of these kind of almost absurd things that I think if we actually had a cohort of people like von Neumann or super smart physicists study 5-MeO DMT or study consciousness directly, we probably would have already solved a bunch of the, it's my sense that it's actually just like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit because there's very little actual intellectual capital focused on these problems. It's not that the problems are like insanely difficult. Well, that's my opinion, at least.
How do you lift the profile of such research then to attract the amount of people and the quality of researchers to study these problems and put more units of effort towards
it's a gigantic bootstrapping problem, right?
I think you're doing a great job though, Andreas and David. In both the different ways. That's why I had you come and speak at this conference, because I think it's very important and it's fun and it's also very ethically important to solve these sorts of things.
I think, really is important to give a health warning in that only people, I think, who are psychologically robust should be exploring psychedelia, and even then there are all manner of pitfalls, which is why, ethically speaking, I think, phasing out biology of suffering, getting invincible well-being, and then as a civilization, by all means, yes, explore alien state spaces. It's a rather intellectually pessimistic, because anyone who cares about the nature of truth and reality, in some sense, people who are drug naive or who haven't taken anything stronger than ethyl alcohol or caffeine, in some sense, I would say are profoundly ignorant. But given the nature of Darwinian consciousness, there is a case for remaining profoundly ignorant in some ways, at least. In that psychedelics can induce extraordinary intensity of experience, which can be sublime or it can be nightmarish. It's rather a boring, depressing message in one sense that I have here. Bit of a killjoy, sorry.
Well, I don't think at QRI you need to be on the ground testing DMT and LSD and whatever chemicals. There's other things to do there, right? You're not just sitting around in circles.
No.
Is that
no? It would be not. It wouldn't work that way, right? Because you actually require, people to write good neuroimaging code that is not compatible with tripping all day all the time. Or getting high all the time. There's a lot of low hanging fruit that actually all that it requires is persistent, sober, level-headed type of awareness. There's a lot to be done just in that space alone, for sure. That said, we do interview routinely, people who, we have this thing called the Phenomenology Club, where about twice a month we invite people who have really extreme experiences or a very large experience base and interview them and try to gather as much information as possible. So it's not necessary for you yourself to do it in any way.
Fascinating.
There is obviously a lot of subtlety here, just to add, which is probably if Sasha Shulgin had the ethics that you're mentioning, I think there's still a lot of things he might have done, right? Like the MDMA series. There's one in particular that has has a methoxy group added to MDMA. It's a very beautiful molecule because I forget the precise name. It might be MMD or something like that. But essentially, it's kind of a hybrid between mescaline and MDMA. It's kind of if you take mescaline and you close the two methoxy groups put together and you get a dimethoxy group. It's very, very close to MDMA, but essentially it's kind of a trippy MDMA. And people describe it as mind movies. And it's wow, it's kind of the energy of MDMA but like the hallucinatory depth of LSD. So there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit of that type of substance as well. That, would overwhelmingly be like a guaranteed positive trip. So anyway, just playing devil's advocate here.
Changing tack slightly, one thing that really daunts me are the organizational challenges, whether we're thinking about transhumanism or effective altruism. In terms of any kind of project of paradise engineering, the transhumanist movement is fragmented. The effective altruist movements, there are considerable, shall we say, differences between classical utilitarian long-termists and people who are more, shall we say, suffering-focused ethics. How can we build the movement? As I said, I find this an extraordinarily daunting challenge. The kind of intelligence and temperament required to build organizationally. In some ways, however difficult it is, writing, actually building an organization can be just so much harder. Andrés, what's the way forward?
Well, I think my presentation gives my thoughts for the time being, which is basically an institutional commitment for eliminate negative extremes, increase baseline, and achieve new heights. Enormous challenges on so many levels, but aligning incentives is very, very difficult. I think you mentioned at some point something like you might have even mentioned something like solving string theory might be trivial for a superintelligence, but solving the political problems in the Middle East is probably beyond that. Well, no, I mean, I'm very, very optimistic that essentially. So here's the picture. So I think my hypothesis is that a very big reason why organizations and social movements fail comes down to the selfish gene. So that essentially we have this egocentric bias where we think that losing power personally is sort of equivalent to the world breaking down. And of course, when you have somebody with actual power who is in that position, they can cause a lot of damage as they sense their power, going out. So that is like a huge failure mode that we have. So much, problems in organizations, in movements, and so on. I think come down to something like that. So I actually am very hopeful that routine access to something like MDMA consciousness, a mature version of MDMA like consciousness that has a softened or reduced egocentric bias, identifies with consciousness more, probably might be conducive to much better organizations. But then again, this is an empirical question, right? It may turn out to be that they are much worse in other illegible ways that we just can't anticipate. But, from first principles, I would suspect that making people more MDMA-like, at least within a circle of trust, will generally enhance productivity and collective intelligence, but remains to be seen.
As I noted in the chat, I thought your expression, the adult version of MDMA consciousness, yes, that would be wonderful. Sadly, there's not yet been any real success or systematic research, sadly, in developing long-term sustainable MDMA-like consciousness. It's 90 minutes, a couple of hours is not enough, and it's not going to solve our problems. Sorry, I meant in the sense that, on MDMA, you not really love yourself, you love everyone else too. And the hugging is simply the superficial manifestation. And if organizations were like that, this would be transformative. in practice, essentially we're still, in many ways, chimpanzees. Chimpanzee troops spend a lot of their time squabbling, making up, competing for power and status. Each of us is subject to the egocentric illusion. There really is a virtual world centered on David Pearce, with everyone else as having these kind of walk-on parts. And of course, you could recognize that it is a delusion, and it's extraordinarily fitness enhancing. It's shall we say, a clue. One isn't a brain in a vat, shall we say, but a naturally evolved creature. The fact that one finds oneself at the center of the hub of reality. It's an adaptation. It's a delusion, but it's extremely fitness enhancing.
Have either of you sort of come into contact anywhere with Daniel Schmachtenberger's sort of sense-making writing? But I found him quite interesting and very well spoken. Broadly supportive. I think I'm not sure what I know this is being recorded, so I probably should be cautious with my person. I very high appreciation. I enjoy his videos and his writings. I do remember I wasn't so happy that he thinks maybe right now trying to figure out consciousness is maybe divisive and not very helpful. But obviously I disagree. But partly because I think there's so much low hanging fruit that it's not just there's so much we can actually say that is meaningful and novel and useful about the nature of consciousness today, and by doing experiments that I disagree with kind of that pessimism, but game B stuff and sense making, very broadly supportive. I gave a presentation called The Aesthetic of the Meta Aesthetic, and if people are curious about my take on that space, that would be the presentation to watch. I gave it on the Stoa about 2 months ago, and that's roughly how I think that You also gave it for my channel too.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I did. Yeah, that's right. I think I gave a better version for you, actually.
Yes. Well, that's good to hear, because it's up there. I'll put a link in the chat for anybody who's interested in.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and that is really important. That it is related to the egocentric world simulation bias that we tend to catalog people as good or bad depending on their values and what they believe, but ultimately is differences in aesthetics. Essentially, what is the archetypes that give a person kind of a thirst for life or a desire to kind of wake up every day in the morning, and those archetypes are different from person to person. The question to me is not which is the ethical aesthetic or the good aesthetic. The question is which ones play well together and which ones can contribute to team consciousness. And I'm broadly fairly open-minded in that aesthetics that may seem very weird at first may actually play an important role. As a random example, is I'm very fond of Ikigai, which is this Japanese aesthetic for how to organize your life. If somebody follows Ikigai, they have kind of a series of bullet points of focus on the details of experience and release yourself, and there's a bunch of fascinating things. It's really well suited to be an artist, not necessarily a philosopher, but I think it's really compatible with a lot of other sense-making tools. So anyway, the vision would be not this monolithic aesthetic that everybody will buy into. It's more kind of how can we create an ecosystem of aesthetics that get along well together? And I think that's where I put my stock, so to speak. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I guess it's just an observation. It seems there's been so much buzz, philosophically and therapeutically about psychedelics in recent years. And I often feel like cannabis, which can have subtle but very interesting and beneficial effects, kind of doesn't get taken seriously. There's the stereotype of the lazy stoner who's not productive and not not productive intellectually or in any other way. And I'm just curious about if you have any thoughts about where cannabinoids, particularly THC, CBD, and then more recently CBG, how they might relate spectrum-wise or otherwise to some of these more potent compounds you've been talking about. Totally.
So cannabis is kind of unique in the state space of consciousness. I mean, cannabinoids, like THC and the variants like GWH48, like the whole range of cannabinoid, psychoactive cannabinoids. My interpretation of what they're doing is essentially they are creating a reverb effect on your experience together with a looping on the short-term memory or the working memory. So, in psychedelics, you move your hand around and you see kind of like lingering copies in your visual field. So psychedelics do that across the board.
I still do that anyway. I think that's just a residual effect.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's called HPPD or post-hallucinatory perceptual disorder. So obviously on psychedelics is like stronger, right? Like even if you have HPPD, like on psychedelics is a stronger effect. We actually have a tool to quantify that. It's called the tracer tool. You can find it online. But essentially psychedelics do this across the board. Like they do this with audio, they do this with tactile feelings, even concepts. Like you're thinking a lot about a concept, you think about something else, that other concept is still kind of lingering in your mind. The way I describe this is the decay function for qualia in your consciousness lasts longer on psychedelics. On cannabis, you have that, but only for working memory. So you have kind of these working memory tracers that are going on. It's not that your feelings, it's not that your vision is creating these crazy tracers or not as much, but your memory is. And that has like unique computational trade-offs. I mean, it has some benefits. Like the first approximation, something that happens a lot on cannabis is that thoughts that usually they would come up and fade and come up and fade, because they last longer. They're looping into your working memory, they overlap. So like a thought A and thought B, they have like a window of overlap because they last longer. So actually, there are thoughts that you can combine on cannabis because of this effect that you wouldn't naturally combine otherwise. And so in that sense, yes, it is an engine of like thought novelty or conceptual novelty. It is also essentially, something that allows you to explore kind of the combinatorial explosion of possible thoughts because of this effect. In that sense, it's a very, very psychedelic. It also synergizes with a lot of other things. I mean, like the first approximation, if you are on LSD and you take cannabis, you will experience a more intense LSD state with some hints of cannabis. I know that like the recipe for kind of this thing called the free-willing hallucination, which is a state of consciousness where you can kind of edit the contents as if it was kind of a Photoshop of experience, is something like 100 micrograms of LSD together with 50 milligrams of ketamine and 10 milligrams of THC. The THC adds kind of that extra reverb, that extra kind of layer that keeps things together and like makes it more, stabilizes the experience. So anyway, there's like a lot of fascinating things about it. I agree that it's kind of set aside, or people are treating it like alcohol these days, even though it's like, no, obviously a crazy psychedelic thing. I will say though that like peak experiences on cannabis are not going to be as clean as like, for example, psilocybin or 5-MeO DMT, because it has this noise component that the other ones don't. So like even when you're like in a very mystical, exotic, symmetrical state on cannabis, there's still this buzzing that is chaotic and not particularly well ordered. So it's not going to be as healing as something like psilocybin. But I do know of several reports, people I know even, that had like very healing experiences on cannabis that were very deliberate. And like the recipe here is like, it's not like, okay, like take cannabis every day and, think of your thoughts. It's more like don't take cannabis for several weeks. And then like for one session that you're dedicated, like you're going to do it to heal your traumas. You essentially prepare for like a whole week to bring up the trauma while you're intoxicated on cannabis. And when the trauma surfaces, then you inject loving kindness. And the extent to which you're going to heal will be roughly proportional to how much of the trauma you were actually able to bring up to the surface, multiplied by what is the amount of loving kindness that you were able to bring into the experience. I mean, there's something very physical that happens, which is that the trauma is going to be kind of this highly disordered, jaggedy, discordant region of your experience, and the loving kindness is going to literally be reordering it via a process of annealing. And so if you can bring it up in a very bright way, cannabis can actually heal traumas at a very deep level. And that's, I think, something that is not well known or researched, but I'm pretty sure is the case. You can do it. But it requires kind of this deliberate effort. Like, okay, I'm going to use it for this purpose. Because, yeah, I mean, the stereotype of kind of the stoner who doesn't do anything or procrastinates all day, that also does happen, but I think that's a different attractor. Or essentially, when it's using cannabis so often that it actually loses its psychedelic edge, and it becomes much more of kind of a stoning, relaxing agent. And yeah, I do think there's a bad attractor there, which is, people just become kind of lazy. But that's very different than like taking cannabis every once in a while and, having crazy new thoughts, which honestly, I think it's not that, I mean, so many good thoughts comes from cannabis, from, personal experiences. So
I think part of the problem in evaluating it has to do with the fact that we're talking about an entourage of compounds. And so it's a completely different issue than this molecule or that molecule. We've got this collection of things, and there may be a great deal of variability from one, so-called cultivar or strain to the next.
Yeah, I mean, the primary psychoactive is going to be THC. And in our model, THC is the primary energizer. So essentially, by creating these short-term memory loops or like short-term tracers, you're piling experience on top of itself. And that essentially is just like you're stacking experience. You have more intense experience. There's more consciousness. That's an energizer. The other things like the, linalool or the various terpenes, like the various like entourages, I think of them as kind of like subtle modifiers of the texture of the vibe. And I think like the main effect is really the THC. The other things are kind of like modifiers. It's kind of like you have a reverb filter and then you have like a little pedal that like, okay, you can shift it a little bit in this direction, a little bit in this direction. I do love kind of the concept of the entourage, and like I make perfumes for a hobby, right? So like this one I call Fearless. It has something like 15 different molecules, and each of them contributes something unique. At the same time, once you play a lot with these things, either with combining drugs or combining smells, you realize that usually there's like some principal components, and like it's rare for, a combination of something like 10 things to produce something that you can't recreate with maybe 3 of them to a first approximation. So usually there's like main contributing factors. So my guess is that there's probably a couple terpenes that account for most of the psychoactivity. And my strongest guess is that linalool is probably the main one, because linalool is also in lavender. And if you take linalool pure, it has this like relaxing effect. And I strongly suspect, cannabis with a lot of linalool is different than just normal cannabis. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Once again, on the downside, for at least a minority, sorry, you can probably tell who has the lower hedonic set point, Andrés and me. A minority of people can experience states of derealization, depersonalization, psychotic episodes on cannabis. It's not a panacea, but broadly it seems to be positive. It seems that so-called runner's high, it seems to be a cannabinoid mechanism, And earlier we touched on Jo Cameron and her anomalously high levels of anandamide, an endogenous cannabinoid, which seems to explain her chronic mild bliss. A lot we still don't know though, and cautious optimism.
I agree with David, and as usual, if you're interested in exploring these and you're psychologically robust, I always recommend starting with very small doses. Anyway, even with cannabis, people have really intense first experiences or the first time it actually hits. I would recommend instead try half a milligram of THC edible form, then try 1 milligram, then 1 milligram and a half. People may get the impression I'm very wild, but actually I approach things quite cautiously in that sense. And I'm sure you probably know about delta 8, but also I'm pretty sure it does have a slightly less anxiety than regular THC for an equivalent level of alteration. Might be worth exploring if THC causes a lot of anxiety and you still want to get high. Delta 8 might be an interesting option.
Well, the CBD can reduce the anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think there's something interesting going on with valerian. I've been exploring that combination as well. The valerian can reduce I've forgotten what the compound is in the herb, but the valerian compounds can also reduce anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be subtle, but yes. For some people, that's all they need, for sure. On the more hardcore end, combining phenibut or something like that. Then again, phenibut has a high risk for addiction, so I don't, recommend it across the board. But if somebody always has panic attacks, well, they probably shouldn't take cannabis in that case. But if they're really insistent on trying cannabis, a tiny dose together with phenibut would probably a psychologically safe way to try.
Or a very, very high CBD content.
But the realization that it can be really powerful, and it's less about a cosmic insight, and it's more about the nature of your own consciousness. Is cannabis changes the texture of your thinking, and that's the very stunning thing that most people don't realize that thinking has a texture of qualia. That it's not that we have the five senses and then thinking just kind of happens. No, there's a way in which thinking feels and that feeling is actually causally relevant and computationally relevant. And cannabis changes that. And, if you've never had your feeling of thought change, that can be a really dramatic and bizarre experience and very illuminating, however disturbing it may be.
Yeah, so, what do you think, from a phenomenological perspective, what do you think is with the short-term / working memory effect? What do you think is happening there? While you're high on weed, not the long-term effects and stuff.
Yeah, sure. Essentially, I think there's the various subcomponents of the nervous system. There's a subset of them that can enter into states of resonance, essentially, and usually the resonance is not supposed to last very long. But when you introduce the right psychoactive, the resonance can linger for a long time. So, essentially something the short-term memory looping that is going on is there is a part of your brain that is entering in resonance that shouldn't be. Again, it could be computationally useful in some circumstances, but it's not going to be in general. All of these is I think they're correlated with a lot of perceptual effects. For example, the intensification of the enjoyment of music that people report on cannabis and psychedelics. It's not just kind of a random effect that happens in addition to many other random effects. I think there's something really, really, really core, which is that you're influencing the neuroacoustics of the nervous system. That's a term from Principia Qualia from Mike Johnson, that essentially there are these metronomes, these various ways in which the nervous system can resonate. Usually we're kind of flipping channels from one to another, and they're very short lasting. But on things like psychedelics or cannabis, you get actually them to persist for a long time. And like you get like resonance to persist for a long time. In some sense, that's kind of like a failure mode, like that shouldn't be happening. But in some other sense, like, yeah, that opens up new avenues for computational and hedonic applications. So, yeah, I mean, like next time you're kind of in a state like that and you're enjoying music, notice how the reason why the music sounds with stronger valence is because it's more echoey and reverby, and it has this depth that it usually lacks. Like it's not just like, oh, the music is producing more happiness, and that's kind of a side effect. It's more like, no, the structure of the phenomenology of the music itself has this reverb quality, and that is what the intensification of music experience is at a more fundamental level. And I think, yeah, something quite similar is like, yeah, the short-term memory looping, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, this resonant state that carries information that is just refusing to die out.
Going back a while about negative utilitarianism, my view is basically that any world that contains negative utilitarianism, that gives rise to negative utilitarianism, is by definition somehow like flawed. It's a sign that something is wrong if someone comes up with anything like negative utilitarianism. Either there's like horrible suffering, or someone is deluded and not representing the situation correctly, and there's both like failure modes of possible realities. And so this leads to solve a question to Andrés and David, which has to do with free-floating pain qualia. If we take the view that what matters is like bound moments of experience, bound mind moments, and possibly if the symmetry theory is true, the structural properties that cause the nasty feeling of it, or maybe something else. But we might also have like cosmic boundaries, some sort of like white hole situations, or there might be some sort of like topological boundary that's like bounding these bound moments that actually bounds these what we would ordinarily think of as like the free-floating stuff that is not part of the like experience of any like subjective moment. And that's something I don't really know how to deal with, how to understand. Should we be concerned not only about the possibility that black holes or exotic states of matter themselves are like maybe very pure qualia, like maybe some sort of like very information poor sort of but like large experiences. Can't we rule out the possibility that the universe itself is a bound experience, sort of like in a negative sense, sort of like as a negative image of all the topological boundaries, sort of like inside of it. Sort of like if my experience is unitary and so on, and it is happening in a universe where we might have like mind dust, qualia dust, how can we rule out the possibility that that isn't sort of like an inverse image of some other like unitary thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I know what you mean. It's so first of all, it's important to distinguish the difference between unitary experience versus having a self. And I mean, essentially the fourth path people, right? Like they have a unitary, they have a bound experience, but subjectively they have no center. Like that experience doesn't, there's no symmetry breaking that actually gives rise to a center within that experience, but it's still topologically bound. I mean, at least within the sort of theory that I explore. I mean, likewise, yes, like disembodied pain, out there in the rings of Saturn or something like that, might actually be something like that, in that like, okay, maybe it has like negative valence, but there's no self that experiences it. In my model, that still is morally relevant. Like you actually don't require a self for valence to matter. That's just kind of like an additional layer that usually causes extra negative valence. That like, oh, and it's happening to somebody, and like you fabricate an additional badness around it. But no, like the negative valence itself is already bad on its own. I tend to have this, I guess, very ambitious, like if you've seen the anime Gurren Lagann, I'm not going to spoil it, but like I'm going to mention a feature about it, which is there's kind of like this constant realization that like, oh my gosh, the problem is like much larger than I realized. And it's kind of like, okay, like the problem was like, oh, something like tyranny in your small town. And then it turns out it's in the entire region, turns out in the entire world, in the entire galaxy. Like, and every step is like, oh my gosh, like the size of the problem is like unimaginably larger, but they don't give up just for that reason. And I think that's my attitude. It's like, hey, yeah, sure. If it turns out that like the real ethical problem in the universe is not, cluster headaches, but it's like this incarnate pain in the rings of Saturn, so be it.
Yeah,
like, that's going to be the new problem.
Like,
let's deal with that. Exactly.
Like, even if it turns out reincarnation is true or something weird, and okay, that's then the like situation we have to deal with. I was actually related to that. I was wondering about the acausality inherent in open individualism, which is that you could have like these causally disconnected parts, inflationary bubbles or whatever, and it's still like you in the sense of team consciousness, even though you aren't like in any, at least from our perspective, like agency, causally, directionally connected. This is something also, like, I spend a surprising amount of time thinking about this, like acausal compassion. Is it simply that we should basically take a very, and in practice, of course, we should take, like, let's deal with stuff. We have very good models and know how to deal. But in a larger picture, could we have an abolitionist project that is not, like, bound within our forward slide cone? Maybe this would necessitate some sort of a causal negotiation or realization beyond space and time. And I don't think this is necessarily mystical. I think we might, if we get a good handle on things like zero ontology and stuff beyond like simply, applying causal modeling technology to everything, we might actually like come to know what would be the best from the perspective of everything, even like, we aren't like causally connected to it. But I don't know, this might be just, weird metaphysical head ripping. But I think open individualism actually suggests that you are not only those moments you are causally connected, but also like everything that exists which ties to your previous answer, like, well, okay, that's then a very weird situation to find yourself in. But okay, let's find out if we can, do something about this. Yeah,
it's obviously super tricky, but I mean, the most meaningful thing I can honestly say about like acausal, it's kind of like you can, in a sense, like blur the lines between epistemology and agency. Where, and I say this in the context of, for example, eternalism, where like, okay, like everything already happened, everything is just there. Like, okay, so why do you do anything? Like, well, the answer is so sure, like we don't have free will, but you can kind of like substitute free will for epistemology. So like when you're doing something, you're in a sense like knowing something. So like doing good is kind of like knowing that there is good. It's actually giving you
evidence. Find out that you actually, by doing good, you produce evidence for like good in the world.
Exactly. Yeah. And so like there's like this hybrid view. This is kind of like weird, but like between eternalism and presentism, which is this idea of kind of like the flow of time is real, but every slice of time is also real. In which case, like, you may think like, okay, so what is the purpose of like me doing anything because there's like all of these other like universes that are behind me and in front of me? Well, the answer is that you doing the action is kind of like the participating in shaping the flow of the river. And so in a sense, like, yeah, you're finding out that the river is shaped this way. You're maybe not doing it itself, but like doing it is an act of knowing that is in a sense important for, yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. I'm not sure if I can really express this thought.
Yeah, that's the weird sort of, actually, even from a sort of like closed individualist view, even in my closed individualist movements, I would prefer to live in a loving and compassionate universe. Simply for very selfish reasons, it would be much better than anything else. So, if you can sort of shape your sort of like self-locating uncertainty in a way that makes it more probable that you live in a universe or multiverse or some sort of like equilibrium of different views about personal identity that is more conducive of like happiness and compassion and love and maybe interesting things if you like those and so on. Even then, and this is, I don't know, you have this Goldilocks zones of self-identity. And I'm not a fan of paraconsistent logic, but I'm a fan of the idea that actually by creating patterns where we sort of like oscillate between these ideas, maybe treating them slightly anti-realistically, if they feel bad, so that they can sort of like fit in, we can, from a very, very like sort of like consensus view, from very different sort of ways of thinking about this, arrive at something that is approximately like pragmatic open individualism. But the funny thing I can say here, I'm always taking the mic. I wonder if like David or anybody else wants to jump in as well. I mean, I'm happy to mention that. Okay, there's this funny phrase I just thought of, which is paraconsistent logic is a fact, which is actually an empirical fact. I mean, like, I'm not saying that like, okay, like it would make sense for the universe. Okay, so for those who don't know, paraconsistent logic is logic where like things can be both true and false, or neither true nor false. It's kind of like you expand the range of possible truth values. So it's kind of insane for me to say, yeah, paraconsistent logic is true. But here's the thing, it is empirically true, because you can actually access states of consciousness that the feeling of it and the semantic content is things such as like something being both true and false at the same time. And like at first you really dislike those states of consciousness because they go against kind of their standard aesthetic, but turns out they also have like valence benefits, right? And like the most refined states of consciousness in Buddhism are precisely those that transcend just normal everyday logic, and they're beyond both true and not true, and neither of them, and so on. And those are like real states of consciousness. So when I say the Goldilocks zone of oneness, okay, like, which is this idea that yes, we are all one consciousness, and we're all individuals, and we're all snapshots of experience. Like people might say, like, well, that's incompatible, right? Like those are paraconsistent, like it's one or the other, or so on. Well, my claim is that experientially, they're not incompatible. Experientially, you could actually experience a superposition of all three. And actually, that superposition is a very positive thing for the most part, because you can choose and pick the best parts of each of those kind of perspectives. Yeah, this strange, because, I actually experience thinking about paraconsistency slightly painful. Like, I literally find it like this slight tightness around the temples and so on. But that's actually a very interesting phenomenon, which of course doesn't carry any sort of like epistemological force. If I get strange feeling here, it doesn't tell us anything about logic. But strange enough, what you say, it sounds like something I'm trying to approximate using these all sorts of things I can find around and which feel like better for me. But I have theoretical reasons for thinking that what you say is true, even though I can't actually believe it, which is a very strange epistemological situation to find oneself in. And
That's so funny. To circle back into something else that you said is is there such a thing as like a topologically open kind of non-eddy or something like that? And I think it's possible. I mean, like in the extreme interpretation of what 5-MeO DMT is doing, and I find it unlikely, but like, hey, like it's a possibility, is that it's actually undoing the topological pocket that essentially is defining the boundary between you and everything else. So in that situation, you would actually literally be merging with kind of like the open field around you. And that almost certainly has no self. And, it's a really transcendent feeling. I mean, the feeling of high-dose 5-MeO DMT is so extraordinary that, like, when you come down, that hypothesis feels very plausible. From this place in which I'm standing, it seems crazy, and I tend to assume, like, no, it's all just happening in your nervous system. But, I leave room open for something extreme like that to be the case.
I have a comment relating this discussion that I think that this kind of framing of what your self understanding is actually this very kind of, there's a very strong evolutionary bias towards kind of the idea that I'm separate from others, right? But then because of these drugs, you can or different states of consciousness, you can kind of like interpolate between these different descriptions. And my guess is there does exist kind of like a formal type of topology of different interpretations of what of the self, I guess. So it kind of like at the very top or bottom, depending on your on how you frame it, there might be like the one true solipsist, let's say, and then at the very opposite end is like, oh, it's all meaningless. There's no even the concept of the self, and then in between you have this kind of interpolation of different understandings of the self, and I guess that can be the superposition and so on. So that's just a thought.
Absolutely. I mean, you will notice that like your interpretation of the self has a lot to do with how your attention and awareness patterns fluctuate over time. That like, I mean, precisely like the people who are in fourth path, where like, they're like in the no self or centerless state of consciousness, they specifically say that they don't experience attention fixation points of attention. So like their attention is not kind of like flickering from one place to another, which is bizarre, right? Like that's our standard everyday life, right? We construct our world simulation by fixating on different parts of it and kind of building this schema. That's not how they experience the world. They experience the world all at once in this like weird holographic way that doesn't partition into different components. So presumably they also have a much more, they have fewer subagents, right? Like, because they have like a much more integrated experience. It's not like, the rest of us who can be like kind of in between, be several subagents simultaneously. And I agree, the God mind or the big self would be kind of the other one that you are talking about, where like there's just one big center of awareness, center of attention, which would be kind of like the solipsistic state of consciousness. Just one subagent. Just one big subagent, and that can feel pretty lonely. I mean, I think a lot of bad trips are actually kind of caused by that feeling. But it's just a feeling, right? I don't think of them as a kind of a universal realization. It's more like, your patterns of attention and awareness converged into this thing that just had one subagent, and like, that's just one state of consciousness. And I'm sure there's categories we can probably, even from first principles, derive like what are the likely categories. That's all of that is like work to be done. Very fascinating stuff.
Yeah, to me, it feels like a lot of these ideas of self, are sort of like constructs that have usefulness in varieties of different areas. Like for ethics, if you see yourself as part of one collective whole, as part of one huge organism, or as part of just one consciousness, one solipsistic state of consciousness, then it makes sense. It makes more close sense, intuitive sense, not to harm, because you're harming yourself, and you don't want to feel pain, do you? Or you wouldn't want to harm yourself, or and somebody distant on the other side of the world, or another creature, a completely different life form, suffering, could be just as morally relevant to you as you stubbing your toe or hurting yourself. If you see yourself through the lens of being part of a greater whole, whether that's the same as trying to look at the universe and trying to find the best descriptions which carve reality at the joints the most accurately, I haven't been able to sort of marry my understandings of how the universe works up with oneness properly yet. I think it's difficult for me. But then again, I don't think it's very easy to say that, individuals have very sharp boundaries either. If you take Chalmers and Clarke's extended mind hypothesis a little bit further and say, well, it's not just the computing, the classical computing that goes on out inside our heads and out on the outside of our skulls, there might be some conscious experience going on as well, then the borders become a little bit more porous.
Yeah, the extended mind.
The extended mind hypothesis. There's distributed minds, and there's situated cognition, distributed cognition, situated cognition, and stuff like that. I think it's really interesting philosophically. There's a bunch of philosophers and scientists working together on these sorts of concepts at the Macquarie University in Sydney, and they've been doing some interesting work. So practical work, yeah.
Andy Clarke is sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, come on, David.
I was going to say that Andy Clarke is explicitly a perceptual direct realist, which runs radically counter to the world simulation model that I think Andrés and I would share.
I'm not sure if his writing, though, on the distributed cognition with Chalmers directly inherits from that view, or that view is required for distributed cognition to hold water, though.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of overlapping things. I mean, I think clearly distributed cognition is the case when it comes to the computational benefits of it. I mean, it is definitely the case that, working with an abacus, gives you some capabilities that you don't have when you're dreaming. You're just imagining an abacus. There's affordances. In the theory of consciousness that at QRI we explore, however, we make the case that there are objective, frame invariant, causally significant boundaries between each moment of experience and the rest of reality. And I think there's a lot of really good reasons why that is the case. I still haven't published the full argument, but it's all in this video that is called the Solving the Phenomenal Binding Problem, Topological Segmentation as the Correct Explanation Space. It's in my YouTube channel. But essentially, I think any theory of consciousness that doesn't have sharp boundaries has a lot of paradoxes and problems, among which is that there's no way to recruit that consciousness for information processing by evolution. So ultimately I'm very open to changing an ontology very radically, but just to, I guess, put it on the table, in my model, each moment of experience has a very, very, very defined objective boundary relative to everything else.
Yeah.
But it is a two sides of the coin sort of thing, because the thing that is making the thing that is inside a topological pocket real or alive, that is made of the field that everything else is made of. So it's really just kind of two sides of the same coin. The question is, are you the pocket or are you the field? And I think the answer is it's both. It depends on how you look at it. And in that sense, it's kind of a soft version of open individualism. It's we're all the same field of consciousness. But also, we should recognize that it has partitions and it has these topological pockets. And what you are right now is one of them.
I think Tristan's got his hand up.
Go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question about
I guess I've been following your work, Andres, for about 2 years now. And I wanted to know like what you think about like the integration of ideas and experience. Cause like, I guess each idea that you have sort of presented carries a very different phenomenological character experience. Yeah. And I guess like, do you just kind of let those arise when they do? Do you trust your intuition with that?
Can you give me an example of just to have a sense of like what you're referring to?
Yeah, I guess the easiest would be open individualism for me to explain. Like when thinking about that and putting that into context with my experience of the world.
Yeah.
There's a lot of processing happening and a lot of maybe just updating. I don't know. I guess like, I'm 23, I'm very young. I wondered if you could speak to what that process has been like for you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very useful to have a mindset of a lifelong learner and also a mindset. Okay. How do I say this without evoking the wrong image? But like, I think a lot of like how I treat my mind, a little bit kind of like recognizing that there is such a thing as kind of an alchemy of consciousness, that we're at the stage of alchemy. And yes, there are a lot of, things such as like, ideas or worldviews that are really reactive with each other. You can produce really strange substances in your own mind by just combining ideas. But then also having this North Star of ultimately getting a chemistry of consciousness, right? Like, so that it's not just like, hey, can we produce gold from lead? But like, no, actually, what is it that you can actually achieve when it comes to combining qualia? And also like a lifelong learner perspective. To give you an idea of like how extreme I think of it is Shenzhen Yang, right? Like very famous advanced meditator. He wrote The Science of Enlightenment. I highly recommend that book. When you talk to him about like, what is the process of growth in a human? He will say something like, like I only consider somebody to be a seasoned meditator or like a seasoned Zen monk when they're like in their 70s or later, 70s or 80s, because there's just not enough time to actually anneal and build, kind of like essentially mature enough, like earlier in your life. Like there's like things that really take that long. And I guess like comparing myself to like when I was 23 years old, a lot of these ideas were kind of bouncing off in my head. But a lot of them were like not very well grounded. So for example, I had some intuitions for how to solve the binding problem, but it really only was kind of like last year where everything clicked into place and I was able to present an argument explaining why every other account doesn't work. But to get there, I had to really kind of like be obsessed about the problem for 8 years and let the qualia alchemy happen for a long time. And honestly also, like exploring those thoughts in a variety of other states of consciousness and seeing, does a new interaction arise? Another thing I think I've talked about is this concept of a high entropy alloy of experience. I mean, to a first approximation, there are many problems that you simply cannot solve unless you have all of the pieces of the puzzle kind of like loaded up in your working memory. So, for example, David Pearce talks about how if you want to solve the problem of consciousness, you have to solve, the causal efficacy problem, the binding problem, the qualia problem, its existence. If you don't solve all of those at once, you don't have a full solution, right? It's similar to trying to go to the moon. Like, if you want to go to the moon, it's not only an acceleration problem, it's also like, hey, how do you keep an airtight container when you're in the vacuum of space? How do you deal with the temperatures and so on and so forth? And my intuition is that, a lot of theorists, whether it's in neuroscience or psychology and so on, what is going on is like they don't have complete theories because they're not actually loading up all the constraints. Like something like, IIT or global workspace theory I don't know. There's so many other like theories of consciousness that I would say like, hey, these are promising. These are solving some problems, but they're not solving the full problem because there's constraints that are not trying to satisfy. So I guess what I'm driving towards with all of this is to say that I highly recommend keeping kind of a lifelong learner mindset. Realize that like actually there's like profound transformations that can happen and they take years. And from a first person subjective point of view, I would say that I get the feeling that I'm still evolving quite rapidly and I'm still getting like new insights, all the time. So presumably this can be a very long journey. I guess like Shenzhen Young, like saying you're not a full Zen monk until you're 80 years old. Before that, you're just not mature enough. That's my feeling. So you're very young. Keep at it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I also have a related thought that I think these types of topics are very like slightly religion-like. Right, and when you think about like what have been the most successful kind of memes that have indoctrinated people are really religions, and so it's very it's like it's very difficult to break away from a kind of preset notion that you've learned from your community or society. And these kind of thoughts are really pushing the boundaries of an intellectual exploration of what is even the space of ideas that are valid. That's just a short comment.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we tend to live in within ontological guardrails put by society and culture and religion. Like if you're obviously if you're hearing this, you probably have a contrarian in you. I would strongly imagine. I don't think you can be interested in this sort of conversation without having a strong contrarian bent of some sort.
Yeah, all heterodoxes. David.
Another thing that's very interesting to me is how, like in philosophical circles. So, for example, you have in philosophical debates, you have people like the two extreme kind of endpoints are people like Dennett versus on the other side, so some of these pure panpsychists, and there's a real form of almost real clash you feel in the arguments, and it's really it almost feels personal, and that's very interesting. Like in no other. Like in math, you don't see this. In no other field, you see this. But in philosophy, you see this type of clash. Very.
Yeah, that's hilarious. But it's very true. Like I think I really loved the Science of Consciousness conference. I went one year with David. Another year I went with a QRI crew. Super fun conference. But like in that space is exactly, you experience exactly what you're pointing at, which I would describe as kind of a ontological turbulence, might be the term I might use. Whereas you're like kind of like see the people who believe in Deepak Chopra walking right next door to David Chalmers and Daniel Dennett, and like this is not a stable, configuration. This is a very turbulent state, and it's good for a week, but I probably would find it very stressful to inhabit for much longer than that. The other thing I'm reminded of is, I think this is, it does come down to an aesthetics thing. I mean, it does come, it has to do with is your philosophy coherent across many levels? Are you able to satisfy many constraints? Yes. Somebody like Daniel Dennett is able to make sense of a lot of reality, but obviously there's a big chunk that is just not really paying attention to. Things such as the binding problem is kind of unintelligible to people like that. But if you look at aesthetics, I think that the emotional response is an aesthetic response. Yes, there is the philosophy, but then how it translates into coordination, into culture, it is an aesthetics thing. And I would encourage anybody listening to this to really pay attention to how aesthetic dissonance is felt in the body. To me, a very stark example was I was at a wedding. A I think like a friend of a friend, and I was just very surprised how like in the ceremony the priest offhand mentioned something like, "Oh, like marriage is a sacred union designed by God to be between a man and a woman," and it's like my thought was like, it's fine, you can believe whatever you want, but like I just realized how like I noticed like physiological dissonance, kind of like, okay, like this like stress level spike is sort of, okay, like somebody's like making this super strong claim with very strong aesthetic implications, and I'm kind of there like forced to experience it. Yeah, it's something like that. Like that was a bit unpleasant. If it was Daniel Dennett instead saying like, yeah, and all consciousness is an illusion, the dissonance is a lot stronger in my case than something like that. So yeah, the turbulence is real. Oh, and of course, like this also explains like there are definitely some circles, like, I think most rationalists are actually really open to qualia research, but there is a core of rationalists who like experience, what we say as like really insulting. It's kind of insulting to intelligence, insulting to the aesthetic, to rationality, and I understand it's an aesthetic disagreement.
Right. Yeah, I felt that similar thing. A Turing Award winner came to MIT to give a lecture on consciousness, on his model of consciousness, and he coined the conscious Turing machine thing, and then and he claims this solves the hard problem of consciousness. And just like I was like so, I was in battle mode. I was like, what are you even saying? Yeah, so I feel that.
Yeah, I mean, what we really need is a TV show, where we give people, like, let's say David Chalmers and Daniel Dennett MDMA, and then they can have a conversation without a trigger response. I think that conversation would be really interesting.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to, I believe it's something Truth. It's a YouTube channel. I forgot his name. I need to look it up. This person having philosophical discussions with basically all the philosophers. Let's find it.
Oh, Kurt, like the theory of everything. Yeah, it's an awesome channel. I highly recommend it.
So this might seem like a weird question, but like, what sort of like imagery do you use when visualizing topological segmentation? Like, how do you visualize that?
Yeah, the most straightforward example is, I mean, I put it on the videos, but if you have like this very long balloon, the idea is that, essentially what you get from the topological segmentation is an objective and causally relevant boundary. So essentially it's kind of like taking the balloon and then twisting it from both ends simultaneously until you get a pinch point in the middle. And like, if this was a mathematical balloon rather than like, okay, like it has definite thickness or something like that, if it's like a mathematical one, there is a precise moment where the balloon actually collapses and you get this pinch point. So that would be the precise moment of a topological segmentation. That is like the most straightforward example. I mean, in reality, there's like entire families of these, because you could take the balloon and rather than like the division being just a point, the division could be a line. So for example, you can take the balloon and then maybe with 2 pieces of paper, or 2 pieces of wood that are very thin, you can push it until you separate the balloon into 2 balloons connected by a line. So that would also be a topological segmentation, but of a different kind. I'll just leave it there, because like those are kind of the most basic examples, but really you have like a whole family of possible topological segmentations. Some of them doing like more interesting thing than others. Like for example, like cutting a Mobius strip in half. That would be another kind of topological segmentation that has a very different type of effect. But the one that I'm like theoretically the most interested in is the topological segmentations of the electromagnetic field. And those are very hard to visualize, but they're there. I mean, the field of science that studies them is called the cohomology of the electromagnetic field. And it's a very big area of research. And without it, without topological transformations to the EM fields, antennas wouldn't work, for example. Like to actually send a signal that carries over a long distance, you need to create an eddy in the electromagnetic field. It's not just an oscillation that goes up and down. Like actually antennas are producing eddies. And so anyway, like topological segmentation in the EM field is routine. It happens all the time in all sorts of ways. It's just for some reason something we don't really talk about very much.
So the difference between a local and a global boundary is just like it's more of a difference in degree, like rather than like a difference in kind.
No. The difference between a local and a global boundary is a stark difference, and I can exemplify it as follows, which is if you have the balloon again, and now let's say you pinch it with your fingers, so you're kind of creating this like lower dimensional, you're collapsing it here wherever you're pinching. So now if you're on the surface of the balloon, you have two options to move from one point to another. You can either walk through the surface of the balloon, or you can go through the pinch point that you generated. So that would be a local boundary, and it's local because you still have the option of just going the normal pathway. As opposed to when you take the balloon, if you make a pinch point, like by twisting it, and you want to go from one point of the balloon to a point in the other balloon, you have to go through the zero-dimensional point in order to get there. So the difference between local boundary versus global boundary is whether you have the option to go through the boundary or if you're forced to go through the boundary.
Got it. Thank you.
But yes, Andrés, thank you, and David, thank you, and all the participants, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the absolute colossal amount of effort you guys have put into making this discussion happen and having the energy to just sit there and answer questions for so long. So yeah, it's I really appreciate you putting in the energy to do that.
My pleasure. It's
it'll be a really wonderful long video.
Yeah. Powered by coffee, undoubtedly. So.